Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Lexington's Community Forum, the people who knew too much about too little, putting the informed back into informed voter. I am Mary Hughes, co-president of the League of Women Voters Lexington, and I am here with the League co-president, Jennifer Jackson. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Stephen Voss, associate professor in political science at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Voss is a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, and worked for a few years as a Louisiana statehouse reporter with Gannett News Service before entering academia. He came to the University of Kentucky in 1998, immediately after earning his Ph.D. in government from Harvard University. And as a specialist in elections and voting behavior, he eventually emerged as one of a handful of political scientists who study Kentucky politics. He appears regularly in local, state, national, and on occasion, even international news coverage of Kentucky and American politics, including serving for years as a political analyst for Lexington's ABC Channel 36. In tonight's program, Dr. Voss will discuss how voters can play an active role in becoming engaged citizens and how to remove the barriers that stand in the way of obtaining political information. And now we're going to turn the program over to Dr. Voss. Dr. Voss?
So normally appearing in front of a nonpartisan reform-oriented organization would be like the safest speaking gig ever, but not so much for a political scientist, because reformers in my discipline usually clash. A lot of the scientific research in political science ends up standing in the way of reform and being a thorn in the side of reformers rather than being something that usually goes hand in hand with it. So I'm here as about as suspicious a speaker, as much of an outsider as you could imagine for a group like this. Partly because of that, even if your norm is usually to wait until the talk is done, I encourage you to stop me if you'd like me to say more about something. I've been through what I could say to you so many times in so many different ways, and a lot stayed on the cutting room floor, and it's possible a question you'd have for me is something that I didn't know would interest you and that I had originally thought about maybe talking about. We're right now in the middle of probably the most intense conflict over voting rules and therefore voting rights that's existed in my lifetime. The last time we really had this level of conflict over what otherwise is usually seen as fairly technical, voting processes and rules, is back in 1965. I mean, maybe you could say after the 2000 presidential election, but even then, it wasn't like this. It wasn't front and center, the heart of what was going on in our political institutions the way it is today. And I really regret that. I regret that where we're focusing now in the aftermath of the last 5 years is on voting rules and the technical side of voting. If you took my survey to the Introduction to American Government, political participation is about the only topic I cover where I get to be mostly optimistic, where for the most part, regardless how we talk about it, where I can tell a story that things have gotten significantly and almost steadily better since the end of the 20th century. In almost every other area of American politics, there's a little more cynicism than there is optimism. The title of the talk that I proposed sort of underscores my pessimism about voting in elections more generally, but also why, really, to me, voter registration and turnout isn't the place I focus when I think about what's gone wrong. We have at our fingertips an amount of information about the world, an amount of information about politics undreamed of at any other time. I mean, the amount of data out there that you can get to if you know how and if you are willing to put in the time is unprecedented. But what we have not done successfully is convert all of this information, all this data, into a healthy political system. the political system is clogged with information being misused rather than used well. So when I was challenged with, what can we do to make voting and the voting process in American elections healthier, my focus was not on the voting side of the informed voter, but a little bit more on the informed side, to challenge you to think about yourself as a pro-voter, pro-voting rights organization, to think about whether more of the attention shouldn't be shifted toward the information side rather than just the voting processes side. Looming over the debate right now, all the controversies over voting rights is the insurrection attempt on January the 6th. I have some pictures here illustrating how horrific that process was. People looked at what happened on January 6th and they were scared. They said, look how weak our democracy is. We have an insurrection attempt on the Capitol that was to a degree aided and abetted by some insiders, especially insiders within the Republican Party. But then what they do with that starting point logically kind of baffles me. They say, look, we had this insurrection attempt. January 6th shows that democracy is weak. And then they make this weird logical leap. Voting reform makes democracy stronger. And therefore, the way we address January 6th is we need voting reform. And this logical fallacy, which, we come up with a fancy Latin name for it, serves for discourse right now about why voting rights reform is at center stage right now. But you can see the fallacious nature of this logic if you just back up and look at it the other way and ask, well, if we pass these voting reforms, what in the world would it do to stop a future January 6th, to protect the government from the kind of thing that happened on January 6th? And the answer is basically nothing. This is not, voting reform, making it easier to vote or keeping it from getting a little harder to vote is not going to stop the real rot in the political system that January 6th represented. But you're a voting organization, League of Women Voters. So what if your focus is going to be on voting? Then isn't voting reform the thing that you could fix, the place where you ought to be focusing your attention? I wouldn't think so, and I don't really get why voting as an end in itself has been such a focus. If you think about how the political process works, there's a world and things are going on in the world, and we're going to use politics and government to try to do something about it. But we don't view that world. We don't have all the data. We only get some kind of distillate of what's going on in the world, and it's filtered through the news media. So the media organizations decide what we see and how we perceive the world. It's filtered through our online networks, the Instagram or Facebook or Twitter feeds that we might choose to use, and information that's delivered to us that way. Our friends and our colleagues, we get sort of word of mouth impressions about what's going on politically, and we turn that into not a view of the world, but an image of the world, a perception, which can be skewed, can be biased, can be very unreliable. And I'm sure you've all got, if you're thinking about this in the back of your mind, your pet example of how people just have a completely skewed view of reality, whether that's what's going on in the environment, what's going on in politics, what's going on with COVID-19. You probably have some handy examples of people who their distilled image of the world and what's going on in it is just so divorced from reality as you understand it, that you just you don't get it. Well, they're getting the information through filters. They then take that image of the world and they need to turn it into some political preferences, and that's going to be filtered through their party loyalties, their party identification. I mean, some people just have relationships with the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, that border on like religious affiliations, and the things they feel can be warped by that worldview. It will be filtered by their self-interest. I mean, if we're talking about higher education policy, I'm a professor. I have interest in what does and does not happen there. That's going to skew how I convert that world into political preferences. And then we have group affiliations. We view ourselves as part of a gender or a race or a social class or an occupational group. And those group loyalties will affect how we convert the world into our political preferences. Okay, so now we have political preferences. And we need to turn those into voting activity. We need to act on them. Well, how do we convert our broad political preferences into a vote choice? Well, that's going to be shaped in part by the political parties. They deliver to us choices. We don't get to vote for all possible candidates. We usually, at most, have two viable choices, one Democrat and one Republican. And the parties in their primary system filters that for us. The election rules. I used to be in Lexington Council District 3. Now I'm in Lexington Council District 10. That's not any choice I made. I didn't move. The district lines did. A lot of people in Lexington it looks as though they're going to find themselves in different state Senate and state House districts in coming elections compared to the ones they were in before. So the election rules kind of shape how we can convert our political preferences into a choice. And then there's the media again. For me to take my political preferences and turn it into action on a candidate, I need information about the candidates. I need to figure out how to take what I want and turn it into a vote for some people. And I rely on various forms of media to do that. Well, once that's done and I've chosen a candidate, now and only now is it a problem of getting past the hurdles to turn that candidate choice through the voting process into a vote. And we see people turn out to express those choices in a vote. Now, I fought with myself over whether I wanted to walk you through that process. It's really pretty straightforward, even though there are a lot of lines in it. There's the world. I form my images of it. That turns into political preferences. That leads to a choice for candidates for whom I then might vote. It's a simple, straightforward process. The point I wanted to make to you is if you go down those steps and you ask, what's broken here in the United States? What's really going wrong? Almost every stage of that process has bigger problems and has been trending in a negative direction. Really, the only one that was getting better over time is the turnout to vote part. To illustrate what I'm getting at, I just showed to you a graph of turnout among people who were eligible to vote. So this is not among all people 18 and up. This is only among those eligible to vote. That's what VEP stands for. Turnout over time. And the first thing I want you to notice, this graph ended in 2018. What's important about that, if I were teaching this as a class, I'd now turn this into a question for you. Why is it important that voter turnout went up in 2018? But I won't belabor it unless you want to take a stab at it. Going once, going twice. All right. What's critical about 2018 is it is before the pandemic. It is before all the changes that were made in voting laws that have been credited with causing the spike in voter turnout. Voter turnout did not spike in the presidential election of 2020 primarily because of changes in voting laws that were adopted, as much as the people who made those changes wanted to give them credit. And the spike that we saw in turnout in 2018 illustrates that. What really shapes turnout is not first and foremost the tinkering with the voting rules. The first thing, the dominant influence on voter turnout is whether people want to vote, whether they see the choices as meaningful enough to them that they're motivated to take a large chunk of time, whether that's showing up on election day to go into a ballot box or getting a piece of paper, requesting it, or opening it up and reading through the rules, filling it out, putting it together, saying that's work. It's always work to vote. You're never going to make it frictionless. And the number one thing that gets people past that friction is that they want to vote. The other thing this graph shows while I'm here is notice 1920, that's when your organization formed. And look what had been happening to voter turnout in the intervening years. Now, once again, it's tempting to people who are rule-oriented and reform-oriented to suppose that the reason we saw this plummeting voter participation in the late 19th, early 20th century was because of changes in the voting rules. And there were some, but a lot of those changes in the voting rules had already been happening, and voter turnout didn't go down. The real pivot point here is the election of 1896. There's another one. If I were teaching this as a class, I would turn into a question. Let me try again. Anybody know what's significant about the presidential election of 1896 and why it would cause a major shift in American voting behavior? Okay, well, if you're students, I'd probably put somebody on the spot, but I won't do it. What changed in 1896 was not the voting rules. What changed in 1890 primarily, what changed in 1896 was essentially the Democratic Party collapsed with the candidacy of William Jennings Bryan, and we entered a new party system that was much less competitive, where basically the Republicans were clearly dominant in a way they had not been prior to 1896. And when voting stopped mattering as much, when people stopped caring as much about having their preferences expressed in the polls, that's when voter turnout plummeted. So once again, turn out to vote to the extent it's a problem, to the extent it's low. Voting rules can help, but the number one reason is desire to vote, a sense of duty and a sense that it matters. And when that changes, when people get engaged with the system, they overcome the barriers, as we saw even before 2020, as we saw going into the 2018 election. Now, this is something for the League of Women Voters and other reformers to pat themselves on the back for. I mean, essentially, the reason why the turnout story is one of the most optimistic ones you can tell in American politics and elections is because the success reformers had in making registering to vote and voting easier. The Motor Voter Act, for example, which your group helped support, played a major role. So Cindy asks, what happened when women were able to vote? Women were getting the vote on a state-by-state basis going into the 20th century. You only get the amendment later. And it is true that this last little dip probably partly represents the change in who was eligible. And suddenly, you almost doubled how many people could vote. Women who had not historically been voting in most of the states up until that point. They'd been voting in the West, but they mostly had not been voting in the states on the East Coast. Sort of took a beat or two before they engaged with the political system at the same rate men did. So the little dip that you see is probably women getting the vote. But if you think about it that way, that the people who were legally eligible to vote almost doubled, the fact that it only dropped a little over 10 percentage points shows you that a lot of women started using the right to vote the minute they got it. Otherwise, that drop would have been much more precipitous. Voting is a habit-forming process. So it only took a couple of elections before we stabilize at a new higher rate. But most of this drop is not because of women, because women were not voting at notably lower rates in the places where they had had the habit to vote. I'm glad you asked that question for another reason, though, Cindy, because one point I like to make when talking about this subject, especially with reformers, is we too narrowly think of voting as this thing individual people do. And when we're trying to think about how can we fix elections, how can we encourage more voter turnout, we overwhelmingly are sort of biased toward thinking about is what can I do to make that one voter more likely to vote, that one voter. But voting is a social process. And a whole lot of that desire to vote isn't something we sort of generate out of ourselves, like we just wake up caring about the election and decide we're going to go show up at the polls. Most of the motivations we get for voting are more social than that. They're influences from our family, influences from our neighbors, influences from our coworkers, and influences from the parties and the campaigns reaching out to us. So when you want to understand why people do or don't vote, if your answer is mostly, well, we made it too difficult to register, we made it kind of a hassle because you have to show up on election day, we're looking in the wrong place, even for understanding the way the system shapes people. The perfect example of this, and it's kind of a funny thing, I don't know how many of you know this already, but one of your other UK professors you've had as a guest before, Josh Douglas, law professor, and I got in a little friendly tussle in the Herald Leader over voting reforms. And in particular, a voting reform called early voting. And that basically means letting people show up at a polling place and vote in advance of election day. And when you think about voting as an individual process, this seems like a no-brainer good thing. Why not force the county clerks to let people come in and vote before election day? Easier for the voters, shouldn't be that hard for the county clerk. How could this possibly be bad? I mean, it might be expensive, might cost personnel time, but how could it possibly be bad? And yet, here's a case where political science research is really unfriendly to reformers and the reform effort. The bulk of research, the really good science on this, by the top elections and parties researchers show that early voting in and of itself is harmful to the political process. It's harmful to those turnout rates that you're seeing. Why? Well, the reason is because people's decision to vote is influenced more actually by social things rather than merely the cost for them personally to cast their vote. You know, if within any family, you know, you've got, let's say, a couple, and one of them is likely to be more politically oriented than the other. Okay, one of them's going to probably not care as much as the other one. It's kind of rare to have two equally committed people. Well, if everybody's voting on election day, then the way this process plays out, because voting is social, is the one partner is gung-ho to vote, and they're ready to go to election day, and they sort of get the other partner awake early enough that they can vote before work, and they go together and they sit there and sip their coffee or whatever, and they cast the vote. And the one person voting pulls the other one in and gets that person to vote when otherwise they might not have. The way early voting can work, though, is the one who's the political junkie, they vote long before the election takes place. And the one who's less motivated won't have the same encouragement from the partner, won't have the same encouragement from the campaigns because they know that a lot of people have already voted, so they don't have as much incentive to concentrate their resources in whipping up excitement and support for election day. And what we actually find is that voter turnout in places with early voting in isolation ends up lower than if you didn't have it. So Doug, we've got two questions. Doug asks, what about compulsory voting such as Australia? Yes, there's evidence that forcing people to vote gets people to vote. I think, you know, Doug, that's where the informed part becomes the real issue. You know, you can force somebody to show up at the polls. You can't force them to know what the heck they're doing, and therefore to cast the vote in any way that would really promote their own interests, or you know, that would represent any of the other stages of my process for a healthy political decision making, other than the last one of turning out to vote. The Australian vote also began in the U.S. The Australian vote is the secret ballot. That began in the progressive era as well. So you're talking during this same period. Did moving to the secret ballot lessen the incentive to vote? Yeah, maybe a little, but in an indirect way, which is the following. People used to bribe others to vote. I mean, they weren't even really all that embarrassed or ashamed about it. I mean, Kentucky politicians would factor into their campaign expenses the fact that they were going to be buying votes in these counties, and that there was a large chunk of voters who weren't real motivated, but they would get motivated if they were given $30 in walking around money or something like that. Once the secret ballot comes into play, the value of bribes, and that's true whether they're monetary bribes or more indirect things like, hey, I noticed your fence is broken. We could get that fixed for you. How about I send some of the party boys over to fix the fence for you while you're voting? You know, sort of a quid pro quo, an implied quid pro quo sort of thing. Once I don't know that you're making good on the promise to vote for my party, the value of these bribes for me decreases. Once you're not getting bribes, you've lost the personal incentive to vote. So in this indirect way, yes, some of these voting reforms led to less voter participation. So Elizabeth wants to know, when did the Australian ballot begin? That was not a federal law, Elizabeth, so I can't give you an exact date. I mean, the earliest ones were in the late 1800s, but different states adopted the Australian ballot at different times. I don't know exactly when it was adopted in Kentucky. I can't answer. I'm not that much of a Kentucky expert. So let me see. has the negative effect of early voting on turnout been measured with regard to people of different socioeconomic categories? Yeah. So first, Marilyn, yes. I mean, there's a whole lot of research results that I'm not ready to toss up here. But if you'd like to know more, you could find the report I submitted for the voting rights lawsuit in Kentucky, or if you give me a way to send it to you, I could send it to you, where I summarized some of that research literature. I also did a related report for Fayette County Clerk Don Blevins, where I summarized in more detail some of that literature for him. I don't think it's available on his webpage anymore. But again, I'm happy to make that available to you. I will give you this little tidbit, which is if you look at the early voting results for 2020 in Kentucky, I was just looking at the ones for Fayette County today. What you'll see for Fayette County is that among the people who voted early, not no excuse absentee balloting. That's a different story. Okay, I was talking about early voting, not absentee balloting. If you look at the vote distribution in Fayette County and in Kentucky as a whole with early voting, it is overwhelmingly lopsided to Donald Trump. Whereas both the in-person voting and the absentee voting was much less pro-Trump. Now, that's not the same as a direct answer to your question about the breakdown in terms of racial and ethnic groups and age groups in terms of early voting, but we do know, sort of the breakdown of who tended to vote for Trump and who tended to vote for Biden. So that's sort of circumstantial evidence that even here, specifically here, early voting's not bringing into the electorate the voters we normally point to as the ones needing help when we look for voting reforms. You know who usually takes advantage of early voting is people who have jobs in the vicinity of the places where you can early vote, and that's often not going to be otherwise often unrepresented people. Indeed, that's that's the sort of perverse function of a lot of reforms, a lot of election reforms, is they don't actually succeed most of the time at bringing into the electorate unrepresented groups. What they do is reinforce biases. They make it easier to vote among people who tended to be inclined to vote anyway, and they can skew the electorate in an even more elitist or an even more unrepresentative fashion than just regular voting. I mean, look, we had early voting here, we had absentee ballot voting here in Kentucky, but who did we see when election time came on election day, banging on the doors, trying to get into vote in the single voting location that had been made available in mid-2020 in Louisville? It was exactly the unrepresented sort of voter that voting reforms are supposed to help. It's just those reforms don't take into account who tends to be likely to get paperwork. And here you had to order the paperwork, sit down, fill out paperwork, package it up, send it on to a voting registrar or a clerk. All of that process is biased toward upper status people. It's biased toward older people. It's biased toward professionals, people who sit at desks a lot and push paper a lot. It's biased toward those sorts of folks. People who are more, who are poor and more working class don't engage in those sort of practices on a day-to-day basis. It's not their jobs. It takes them out of their normal behavior. They're much more likely to get caught up in the excitement of an election day and want to go vote for their candidate of choice when everybody else is doing it as part of a group process. And I remain, I can never prove it, but I suspect that Charles Booker would have defeated Amy McGrath in the primary for in 2020 if the rules hadn't been of a sort that helped McGrath voters and helped McGrath compared to Booker. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna push on how I feel about 16-year-olds voting. I don't know. We're gonna do it, or we're gonna do it in the way I want to talk about, in a way that might make voting better or not. I guess that sort of shapes how I'd feel about it. Okay, so Which of those steps are broken? You know, I talked about how the turnout side is really a lot less broken than almost any of those other steps. But which of the steps are broken? And therefore, if I were a concerned citizen trying to ask, you know, if I were part of a league of women voters trying to ask, what can we do to make the election process healthier in the United States? This is where I'd be looking and trying to come up with ways to counterbalance. I see problems in the news media, I'll talk to you about in a second. Online networks, I'll talk to you about, but there's so much research on that these days that I really just don't have time to summarize for you. Friend networks, problem there, and then getting good candidate information. So let me talk just quickly, I'm not going to belabor these things. Let me talk to you about this a little bit, and then probably you'll want to discuss or ask questions. So let me start with the news media. I wanted an example for you. I didn't want to just talk in abstractions. I looked for an example of a local election because that's really the story I want to talk about is how pathetically little information voters have about elections below the presidential, maybe the senatorial and the gubernatorial level. So I picked sort of the highest, most important election I could below the ones that get all the attention. And they get attention from national media. So, you know, the Kentucky State Senate only has 100 seats. Senators are pretty important. You know, Fayette County's only got a handful of them. So who we have representing us in the state Senate seems like a pretty important decision made for women and voters and everybody else. We had in 2018 an incredibly close state Senate race. A long-term incumbent, Republican Kerr there, Alice Forgy Kerr, was challenged by someone, not really a teacher anymore, but she was in an education-related profession, a Democrat who ran a grassroots campaign against her, Paula Setzer-Kissick. And as you can see, this was a squeaker. I mean, very, very, very close to upsetting this incumbent here, right? It's less than 800 votes between them. So if there's any local election that the news media, that the, you know, sort of social procedures should have let Fayette County residents know about, this would have been the case. This would have been the race. So I went into the Herald Leader online archive and I searched, you know, the last name of the Democratic candidate. It's pretty remarkable. You search on that, it's not going to pop up for a lot of other people. I searched on her name and I found exactly 3 news articles from the entire, well, really, I mean, I searched for forever, but I found literally only 3 articles from before that election that would have told voters anything about this choice that they had to make. There was a single Jack Brammer story that dealt with the Democrat criticizing the Republican for voting the right way, but not enthusiastically enough on a teacher's pension bill. And if you read all the way to the very end of that story, something that we know very few news consumers do, you also would have learned that basically the Democrat leaned pro-choice, whereas the Republican was pro-life. I think there's one other issue you would have learned something about them. But I mean, literally, this whole article, the one real article on that race that I found in those archives, you learned almost nothing about these candidates. There then was a single letter printed by somebody who supported the Democratic candidate. Finally, you got the Herald Leader's endorsement. So this critically important race, and there were 3 stories that popped up in their regular news and showed up in their news archives. Just incredibly little information. Now, well, was there other information elsewhere you could have learned? I mean, you folks hosted a candidate forum. I suppose people could have come there. You know how many people attended. I'm guessing it was nowhere near 50,000, which is the number of people who voted in that election. I suspect you were happy if you had 50, because that's what usually shows up at an election forum. Very Ballotopedia, nothing you couldn't have learned in the Herald Leader endorsement about the candidate. Was there a single news article on who was contributing to those campaigns, where they were getting their money? No, there wasn't. If a voter wanted to know who was backing the Democrat, where she was getting her money, they had to go digging into web pages, downloading campaign reports at a month at a time, putting that stuff together. If the journalists weren't doing it for them, almost nobody was doing this. I mean, they would have learned some interesting things, but all this information is there. No process for distilling it and getting it to regular voters so that they could make a decision. All right, let's see, I have a comment or question here. You know, it's interesting, Jen, you say, unfortunately, incumbent candidates decline to complete voter guides. Well, in all the places I looked that allowed the candidate to talk back and fill out candidate surveys, so Ballotpedia had one, VoteSmart had one, the Challenger hadn't filled them out either. So you couldn't even have used the Democratic candidates' answers and sort of guessed the Republicans. So Maureen says we can't have two candidates if one of them decides not to come. I think I read that Kerr, the incumbent, who's normally, normally it's incumbents who dodge candidate fora, that she did show up at your forum. I may have been confused what year she showed up, but I did see a reference to her showing up at your candidate forum. I mean, maybe the challenger didn't show up, but that would be rarer. Usually they want all the attention they can get because they don't have the funding. She didn't have, I guess she had like a quarter of the funding that the incumbent had. Okay, so there's the first problem, the news media. And the point I wanted to make to you there is that the elections where we're most likely to make a difference, the elections where, 2 votes, a couple of hundred votes might swing things, we have pathetically little information to us. What we have instead is we're flooded because more and more we rely on national media and social networks that are circulating national media. More and more we have information about the couple of banner marquee contests that we're really unlikely to make a difference about, and almost nothing about the races where we could make a difference, where we are making in smaller numbers in our communities choices. And that only encourages what we see, which is more and more people just voting a party line, ignorant about the choices they're making. Okay, so let me move to I had partisan originally in parentheses. I probably should have left it there, news media, because part of the point I want to make here is that we've gutted the sort of respectable mainstream media that at least tried to be objective. We've seen plummeting circulations with the Louisville Courier-Journal and the Lexington Herald-Leader. And the story's even worse in some other communities about what's happening to their papers. And what we've seen people replace those at least semi-objective journalists with is much more partisan but free, much less reliable but free media sources. And they tend to be much more partisan. Well, the fact that we're consuming more and more partisan news, the fact that we're learning about those top-level contests, and that's overwhelmingly what they talk about, those top-level contests from these highly biased sources has basically stirs up trouble. It's causing conflict. You want to talk about the kind of thing that leads to January 6th? It's this slide right here. Okay, it's what the story I'm telling you here. In this More in Common survey, you can see it's from 2019. It's fairly recent data. People were asked, do most Republicans hold extreme views? Do most Democrats hold extreme views? And then they compared what they thought they believed to what the actual Democrats and Republicans who were answering the survey believed. And as you can see, we have an extremely biased view of both Republicans and Democrats. We think members of those parties are way more extreme than they actually are, missing by like a quarter of the electorate. Why? Well, this is not just Democrats or just Republicans. Here is how Democrats view the typical Republicans' views, and they are way off. Asked what they thought a typical Republican's view on immigration was, on whether racism still exists in America, the typical Republican's attitude toward Muslims, towards sexism, question after question. Democrats thought Republicans were way more conservative, way more extreme than a typical Republican voter actually is. The Republicans were just as bad when trying to estimate what actual Democrats believe their estimates of how Democrats felt toward police or toward being an American, and so on, just terribly off from the reality of what their fellow citizens believe. So we've got these stereotypes that have built up about the other side, and it's way more polarized, way more negative than the reality of the Americans who are out there voting truly believe. Who who's getting this wrong? Who's got the most misleading perceptions, the greatest amount of stereotyping and prejudice about the folks on the other side? It's basically a function of ideology. It's the ideologues, progressive ideologues, and conservative ideologues have much more skewed perceptions of what members of the other party believe. More moderate liberals and conservatives, they're not nearly as mistaken. Does consuming news media help? Not at all. The more media you consume, because it tends to be partisan and biased, the more wrong you are, the less informed you actually are as a result of consuming all this information that's not information, this political misinformation. You might have guessed, because there's been a lot of criticism of conservative fake news sites, that people who consume some of the biased conservative media are especially likely to just be divorced from the reality of what a real Democratic voter feels, and that's true. Breitbart was the worst offender. People who consumed Breitbart were furthest off in their sense of what Democrats believed. Drudge Report, Red State, also conservative sources, but not that far from it. You get the left-wing biased news sources, causing the readers to have very skewed opinions of Republicans, and sort of consistent with conservative complaints that the New York Times and the Washington Post is biased in a liberal direction. People who consume the New York Times and the Washington Post tended to have skewed views of what Republicans believe as well. So there's problem number two, and in a way that's much more tied to the threat to our system. We are not only increasingly polarized, increasingly prejudiced, increasingly likely to hold stereotypes about the folks on the other side. The places we turn to inform us are the worst offenders when it comes to adding to that polarization and divorcing our sense of what's going on from reality. Third thing I said I wanted to talk about is friend networks. We increasingly live in echo chambers where we are further both convinced of the rightness of the things we believe and convinced of the wickedness of the people who disagree with us. This is true whether you're thinking of friends in a face-to-face sense, or instead in a mediated sense through electronics. What we see in community after community, this is a map of Fayette County broken up by precincts. What we see is increasingly people are segregated by politics. And there are more and more very, very blue neighborhoods in places and very, very red neighborhoods in places. This is what one journalist called the big sort. We have sorted ourselves out into communities in ways that correlate heavily with the sort of candidates we like and the political beliefs we hold. It means we live in echo chambers where almost everybody around us agrees with us and flatters our own attitudes and reinforces our anger. And we have very little exposure these days to people who would disagree with us. I mean, if you live in a place that's 80% Republican or 80% Democratic, most of you just are going to keep it to yourself because we're social creatures and we don't want to be hated by everybody around us. Social media is really even worse. What we see, and they admit it, is that people on both the right and the left admit they're likely to block or unfriend people who express political views at odds with theirs. Both liberals and conservatives, their social media networks only have about 20% of people who hold different political views from them. Those 20%, again, not wanting to be the center of negative attention, usually don't speak up. They enter what's called the spiral of silence, and they just keep their politics mostly to themselves, so that the sort of echo chamber is even more of an echo chamber than it would be if everybody were expressing what they really believed. Now, if you've been in some of these liberal or conservative networks, you do know there's that one or two folks on the other side who are completely unembarrassed about expressing their opinion almost everything that shows up. But they're not representative. The one or two Republicans who are in everybody's face in a liberal chat group, the one or two progressives who are in everybody's face in a conservative chat group are not representative of folks of their party and their ideology. They're what we call trolls. They're people who glory at combat. They just add to the prejudices against folks like them, but they're not representative. We also know from studies of Twitter, for example, that lies, things that are partisan but absolutely provably false, spread way faster over these echo chamber social networks than the truth. And if a lie is sort of publicized on one day and a correction is issued 2 days later, the falsehood that is politically useful spreads 10 times as far to 10 times as many people as the correction that comes back and says, no, we got that wrong. This is partly because there are people, nodes that we call super spreaders, who they just take this fake news and they spin it out at a fairly constant rate. Very few people spread fake news, but the ones who do spread it in mass quantities, and therefore they get lots of exposure. So there's another problem. And then, okay, finally, so we've cast these votes. We've indicated the people we want to see in office. What do they do with it? The vote is a very blunt instrument. Can they figure out what the vote meant and convert it into the policies we asked for, that stage of the process? And the answer is this conversion of voting to the behavior of our leaders has broken down. One reason is because we're so partisan and so skewed. As I discussed before, these days politicians have very little incentive to try to please the voters who didn't support them, because they're being an incumbent and trying to satisfy the voters back home has less and less payoff. The incumbency advantage, as it's called, has weakened, and we just don't have the incentive to make people happy anymore. We have over time lost information about why voters did what they did and what they were trying to communicate to their leaders with that blunt instrument. The Bluegrass poll, which the Herald Leader and the Courier Journal used to collaborate on, it ran into some turbulence. It cost money. They basically dropped it. We don't have that polling information about what's going on in Kentucky elections anymore. The UK Survey Research Center closed. Now it's officially closed in 2020, but it had been on the way out for a long time. We weren't getting good information about Kentucky voters through that source for a long time now. And unfortunately, recent voting reforms, the voting reforms we saw in 2020, have only made that lack of information about what voters are thinking, what they want from their leaders, worse. And this is my last slide to illustrate it to you. Now that we have people voting by mail, now that we have people voting early, it's much harder to talk to them as they leave on election day and find out, why did you vote the way you did? Exit polls were basically undermined in the 2020 election. Nobody really trusts them. And we used to have voting data on all these precincts so that I could answer a question like Cindy's about, how's this playing out with people of this economic group or that economic group, this racial group or that racial group. Well, let's look at the 3rd district here where Hannah Legree runs for office. It's the one right centered under the word Lexington. Now, if we had still been voting traditionally, sort of on election day, where you could group things by precinct, then she would have had information about all those little subdivisions of the district and know where she was strong, where she was weak. She could have made efforts to appeal to voters. She could have turned that into a campaign strategy for reaching out to people. Instead, this is what she gets about her election in 2020. 5 numbers, not grouped by any meaningful geography. It's basically uninterpretable as a message to our council member about why she won that fairly narrow victory. I wouldn't say I worked with her campaign, but I collaborated a little bit with her campaign manager to talk them through how they could get better information about their voters by precinct. And there really wasn't a whole lot. To the extent there was anything, it would have been more expensive than an urban county council District 3 candidate could afford in order to reach out and to the voters or get information about them. All this is broken down. So the question was, well, what can you do? And that's my answer. If you really want to improve voting, you want to fight for, loosening registration rules, make it easier to vote in various ways. Usually won't do any harm, early voting being the exception I've talked about. But put the informed back in informed voter if you really want to make a difference, if you really want to address the things that are breaking down and threatening American democracy right now. Breaking down those barriers in communities so that people have those bridges across party lines, across neighborhoods, so that they know more, and so their candidates know more. Taking some responsibility. When the League of Women Voters formed, it wasn't about getting people the right to vote. They formed as the 19th Amendment was passing, as women were getting the right to vote, so that women could be more effective and more responsible voters. They did not view voting merely as an end in itself. They saw more for the organization to do. And I still think there's more for the organization to do. If others aren't making that sort of local information available, if Ballotopedia can't do it, if the Herald Leader can't do it, maybe you could do it. Or as a respected and influential organization in the community, maybe you can pressure the Herald Leader. They did just recently announce that they're adding some news staff and trying to give us more political and community news. Well, hold them to it, and keep giving them feedback as a respected organization that people need to know more about these important choices they're making, and then better electoral information, because what's being made available to us through public agencies has only been getting worse and getting sketchier and requiring more and more money and expertise to do anything with, to know anything about. So that's my challenge to you: is look beyond voting rules, think about how you can make elections and voting healthier, not just more. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I think the question, and I think you did just answer it, but Mark Scar had asked, how can the League and others improve voter education? And you're just saying we need to make that information available ourselves on the candidates and pressure the media to give us that kind of information and make it more widespread. Is that what you're saying?
Think about how stunning this is. I mean, we have the capability to collect, to store, and to publish information like never before. Right? Running a publication now is dirt cheap, and cheaper than it's ever been in the history of American politics. And yet we have less by way of sources of information about our political life than ever. And that can be fixed. I mean, Barefoot and Progressive, the blog that Joe Sonka operated for a while before the Courier-Journal hired him. I mean, the costs of running that thing were negligible. It just, that's a form of activism, and it's the one Joe chose, but very few people choose.
Okay, sounds good. Does somebody else have a question for Steve?
Steve, were you suggesting that the League could work with the Herald Leader in forming questions for candidates, or?
I do think you could pressure them to cover things. I mean, I didn't see a whole lot of coverage of your events, for example, in the Herald Leader. And this is true up and down journalism. When UK holds their student government debates or whatever, the journalists in journalism school are not being trained to think they need to cover those things. They don't cover them even on campus in the campus paper. So pressure them to get that information to you. But yes, I'm also suggesting you've got a web page, right? You've got a way to get out information. You've got people who are very active in the community. Some of you may be retirees who would enjoy helping spread information about elections. And if you had the format to do that, the way to do that.
Steve, there was
actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because we do have a format for us as individuals to be able to share information with our friends or colleagues. So I put it in the chat. We have a new relational organizing called Outreach Circle. And it makes it very easy. For example, when we have issues like voting rights or other information, it allows you to share that information that we provide with your friends and your family. And so it makes it super easy because the email is already been created for you. You can edit it, but there's also a way you can use it through text messaging. But what makes it nice is that you don't have to come up with an email on your own, and you can also share it with as many of your friends as you want to. And it's super easy. You just download the app on your phone. It's for free. You can get it at the App Store if you have an iPhone, or you can get it on the Play Store if you have an Android phone. And you download it. The League of Women Voters of Kentucky has an outreach circle, the Lexington League, and then also Northern Kentucky. So if you just follow the Lexington League, and then also the State League, because we kind of deal with different issues. Here in Lexington, it would be more like local elections, get out the vote, voter registration. State League deals with a lot of things like voting rights restoration for people who've had prior felony convictions, and then also redistricting. Dr. Voss mentioned that in his talk about how your lines get redrawn, and that definitely happens. And by having voter input and awareness about that, and putting legislators to draw those lines with voters in mind, rather than preserving elected officials' positions, which is not why redistricting is not the foundation of why redistricting needs to happen. It's not to keep politicians in office, it's to figure out which voters need to vote together. But anyway, you can check it out, and it's a great way to also keep up with what's going on with like our next events and that type of thing.
So I was asked two questions, or people asked two questions. I don't know, they were for me. One was about the value of polling, and one was about the value of letters to the editor. I'll start with letters to the editor. They're nice, but no, I don't think they're terribly helpful. Why? Because they tend to reach the same people who get good political information from lots of other ways. I'm less certain about the resource Jen described about who's going to get that and who gets to see it later. I'm guessing this is not something available to the public, because I experimented with a handful of Lexington area politicians, searching on Amanda Bledsoe, searching on Kerr, searching on, to see what you could learn about those folks. And I didn't ever see, other than that one reference to Kerr appearing at a League of Women Voters event, I didn't really see anything from your organization that would have helped voters. And I guess that's what I'm challenging you to think about there is step back from the usual sources of spreading information and ask, what can I do for the less committed voter, the person who doesn't come to events like this, that doesn't attend candidate fora, who's sitting there with a sample ballot and trying to decide whether to vote for the incumbent or for the Democratic challenger with their paper ballot. What can they really learn about the choice they're making? My answer to you is right now, not a lot. And it's no surprise they just vote the D or the R at that point, when there's almost nothing available to them that's politically meaningful. Well, what can you do to leave a record for that less committed voter, the sort of person who's usually disenfranchised, or if they are franchised, they're voting based on very little information?
Mark has another question. Do you have any guess how widely viewed are our local TV news and Herald Leader? Would greater coverage make an imprint? Yeah, so, there's two answers there, right? We know Herald Leader circulation isn't great, and we know it's declined, and they're struggling to try to pick it up. But very few people these days get their news the way the old model of the reading newspaper worked, where you get it in a day, it's chronological, and you flip through and you read the headlines, maybe, if you didn't skip straight to the sports section. And there might be the one article you read, but you only read to where it says jump to page 3. And then,
that's always been the way people process the newspaper. Fewer people get their news that way, though. More and more get it from searches when they're interested, right? Searching on the name Amanda Bledsoe, seeing what they can see, what's going to pop up in Google. You know, that's if I give my students an online test, they don't even go look at their notes from my class or their textbook. I mean, they still, if I give them an online test, they go to Google and Wikipedia for their answers, right? So given that that's the way people learn, I'm suggesting try to find ways to supplement the Herald Leader on yourselves as part of that role of helping people not just vote, but vote responsibly, as the League of Women Voters originally had as its mission. Now, here's a great question. You know, Catherine, I said there are a bunch of things that I left on the cutting room floor, and wow, is this one, the social opportunities to vote. You know, prior to that 1896 election, political engagement was so completely different. What I tell my students, it was more like a UK tailgate party than it was like elections today. You know, there were parades, there were festivals, and you know, sort of the 19th century equivalent of face painting for the kids, and it was very much of a social event. A political scientist, one of the best, a guy named Don Philip Green at Yale University, got the money to do an experiment. And what he did was he took two sets of precincts that were mostly similar. They were similar in their sort of social background, in their previous political behavior and all. And what he did was, with each of those two pairs of precincts, he scheduled a social event in one, and he left the other one alone. So there was one of these events near the polling place where you could come and maybe have a refreshment, and the kids could get their faces painted, and it made it a social event rather than this you know, intellectual thing where you read the position papers and then you go to the polls and all by yourself you pull something, and your big social reward is you get a sticker. And what he showed is that in the precincts where he intervened and created this social voting environment, turnout spiked compared to the places that did it the sort of stripped down, sort of upper middle class form of political engagement. So yeah, if you can throw election parties in you know, neighborhoods that you think have insufficient political representation, you'd probably do a lot more good for them than you would by tinkering with some registration rules.
You've given us a lot to think about, Steve. A lot.
Hey, you said I'm from New Orleans. Is it any surprise my solution to fixing politics? No more parties.
Yes, it sounds great. And you've given us a lot to think about. Jen was saying, I think you had a question about Outreach Circle. It is an app that anyone can use. It's not just the League of Women Voters. So anyone can use it just by downloading it. And then Cindy just said something. Maybe we need to create election parties next election. Sounds like fun, but lots of work.
Cindy, preparing for and going to a tailgate party is even more work than that. But wow, people do it in large numbers, let me tell you. People will spend a lot of money and time when it's for fun.
Well, Steve, maybe the league will invite you to one of our election parties soon. Do we have any more questions for Steve? It's been wonderful. There's so much that we could talk about.
This is Cindy. Your comments about not being able to get data, does that have to do with the single polling places? And, you know, if there are fewer polling places, we could have a bunch of parties. Having polling places at every precinct would be pretty challenging, but it was that part of the problem with the single voting sites?
So maybe yes, a little bit. If you have a single voting site, then you know who voted, right? And you could do the work of figuring out which places are represented well and which places are underrepresented. But you wouldn't know how the people from each of those places voted. So sure, that's part of the issue. And I don't know if you know this, but I was highly critical of that single voting place system. That's one of the things that I think disenfranchised Charles Booker supporters, is the fact that in Louisville there was one place to vote. You know, and getting across a rural county to vote might cost you some gas, but the traffic is usually going to be that awful. Trying to get across downtown Louisville after work before the polls close. That was a real thing. I mean, you want to talk about disenfranchised voters. There's nothing that Georgia Republicans are doing that can measure up to Louisville traffic as a source of disenfranchisement. And yeah, so that's part of the problem. But, when people mail in their ballots, the clerk knows where they're based. The clerk knows where that vote's coming from. So that's just a technical solution, right? To trace the vote, to keep track of the vote so that it's linked to individual precincts. There's no reason why those absentee votes, and I'm betting no reason why those early votes couldn't have been grouped by precinct rather than into just 5 rows in a spreadsheet. But that's
Stephen, I saw Michael Adams get that question, and I don't remember the format, but he got that question and he was interested. And I think he said technically he thought they could figure that out, even if you voted outside your precinct. I'm pretty sure he was pretty positive about that could be resolved.
so I'll tell you why he probably was positive about it. Is that Mary saying that? Mary, they're probably positive about that is he knows that it would be the county clerks who would have to actually do the work.
Yeah, right.
And so it wouldn't be his problem. Nonetheless, no, that's absolutely right. And that's where,
But technically it may not be that big of a problem.
no, I mean, it would take some work on their part, and it probably would require some pressure from a respected organization that, nonpartisan organization saying, hey, these candidates being able to reach their voters, that's part of the healthy process too. It's not only about the voters being able to get into a voting booth, it's about the candidates being able to get their messages to them instead of barriers being erected to prevent that linkage, that communication. And, like I said, talking to Hannah Legree's campaign manager, he was just, there was no affordable way to get the good campaign information. And what they relied on was like polls at the end of texts that they sent out, right? Which polling goes terrible because you're not at all getting anything like a random sample of your voters, but they could afford it, So yeah, any pressure on these campaign officials to stop retreating and making information available to us is something valuable you could do. I mean, you used to be able to get by precinct information on registered voters, and it was easy to do. You just went onto the webpage of the Board of Elections and downloaded it, and you could know every precinct, how many men, how many women, how many Democrats, Republicans, independents there were registered. I can't find it now. I'm sure a Freedom of Information Act request would cough that up for me, so a campaign could do it, but no regular citizen's going to be able to go, learn about their precinct conveniently.
How are you going to keep people from planting this is Maureen Murphy, from going just to where they want to hear the news? Because in today's world, you don't have to show both sides of the story, both sides of an issue when you have someone on TV or radio or in a blog or any place. That's been taken away. And so that's where people love to go, where people agree with them. So it's very hard to combat that.
Well, you're right. With broadcast media, there used to be that fairness doctrine that caused some balance. But given how few people get their political information that way, given that they tend to be the people who are skewed already, I just don't know that that's where I'd start to try to fix things. I've been on those radio shows. You could have brought I've been on the conservative ones. You could have brought a Democrat on. It would have done nothing to change those people who are hammering me. You liberal college professor, and all that. Those tend to be very politically motivated and therefore already biased people. That if you want, good, healthy elections, you really need to reach the people who don't sit around listening to news radio, who don't go to candidate fora.
Cindy Heine had another point that she made. She said the information on precinct data is available on a set of maps created on Dave's redistricting@lwvkentucky.org. Are you aware of that, Steve?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, Louisville, for example, did break down their election results by precinct. Like I said, there is the ability to do this. And if you go check the report, the election report from Louisville, for example, they broke it down by precinct. So yes, there is for sure the capability to provide this sort of information. Some places at least did.
Okay, so it just depends on the
And that
people in charge.
data isn't the actual voting data, it's just the numbers of people in each precinct, male, female, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. It's not, but it doesn't give voting records.
So basically, they grabbed the report that you used to be able to get easily from the Kentucky Board of Elections. Yeah, they probably demanded it and then posted it because it's public information. You can do that, and that's
Well,
kind of
this is for the new maps that have just been adopted. They're not final yet because they haven't been signed.
okay. So that's not voter registration. That's just population information.
It's population, but it's also voter registration in terms of party, sex, whether it's voting age or population. And
Yeah,
that's all
so
by precinct.
I should probably know more of this before I say anything definitive, but I did look at those data from the last census, the 2010 census, and the way, it's complicated trying to estimate who lives in a precinct because the Census Bureau isn't organized by precincts. It doesn't collect its information. And it's actually this hugely complicated, thorny demographic thing trying to figure out what precincts, what the population of precincts are. And at least in 2010, my sense of what they did to guess that is nothing you'd want to take to the bank. Nothing you want to
Okay.
base a make or break state Senate campaign on.
I'll see if I can't find that and send you the links. I'm
Sounds great.
struggling to find it on our website. I know it's here. I just can't find it.
That would be great if you could do that, Cindy. Anything else for Dr. Voss? Steve, thanks so much for all this information. It's been great. And I know you've given us a lot of valuable information that the community members and community groups in Lexington can use. For people that want to tell other people about this program, it is recorded, as we said. It can be viewed on our website, lwvlexington.com, looking for community forums under events. And just check our website, www.lwvlexington.com, or Outreach Circle that we were talking about for coming events. And if you're not familiar, as Jen was saying, there is an app for Outreach Circle that you can download to your phone. So you can be one click away from taking action with the League of Women Voters. You can download it for free on either the App Store for iPhone users or the Play Store for Android users. Remember, Outreach Circle is one word. Search for Kentucky to join both the Lexington and the State League's outreach circles. I've got two final notes for everybody. Our next community forum will be Thursday, February 24th, 2022 from 7 to 8 by Zoom, where we'll be celebrating Black History Month with a presentation by Sandra Morgan, who is the granddaughter of Garrett Morgan, who is an African-American inventor, businessman, and civic leader. And he was born in Paris, Kentucky, although he lived most of his life in Ohio. I think it's going to be a wonderful program. So you can register again at lwvlexington.com under events. And one last thing, we would like to tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters Observer Corps. Cindy Ward, our Observer Corps chair, is here tonight. She wants to say a few words about that.
Hi, this is Cindy Ward. We're working on the Observer Corps, and I'm trying to perhaps build up some interest in going to some of our to observe some of our government at work. I've just started looking into more of the Fayette County councils and boards, and we have great opportunities. The Board of Elections is one that We could certainly see most of these meetings, or we could certainly observe, and naturally we were interested in the Board of Elections and what they do. And that the person that goes and goes to the meeting just reports on things that the league might be interested in. The council also, we need people to look at, to visit. The council, though, so many times has all the boards report to them. So I'm sure all of you have heard about our Lansdowne tree situation. That's all covered in the environmental meetings. Please email me one time a month, visit a meeting. Some of the meetings are still on Zoom. Get active and find out what we can do to help our local Lexington, Kentucky and Fayette County group so we know what's going on. Thank you.
Cindy, I put your email in the chat.
Oh,
so-
thank you. I didn't have everything I wanted to say written down, so I stumbled. And thank you, Dr. Voss. Everything was so informative. You've given me so many ideas.
Thanks.
Appreciate
Steve.
being able to spend the evening with you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night. Thanks.